All right, everybody, coming in, grab your virtual seats. And hello and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 290th, being recorded on Thursday, June 17th, 2021 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, we've got David Byers, again, who's going to be talking about, and it's a preview of his CF Dev Week talk next week, ColdFusion Modernization Challenges, improving legacy code while retaining your sanity. Now, before we turn it over, I just want to point out a couple things. You can see at the bottom of the screen that you can, share the word about the meetup by just pointing people to ColdFusionMeetup.com, and you can find the recordings of the past meetings at this listing at recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com, or just go to YouTube and these link to that. And in fact, let me just share a couple more points. Yep, that. And then if you'd like to present, we're always open to having people present any topic tangentially related to ColdFusion, Lucy, things like that, and offer, you can find out more and then identify yourself to me and I'll follow up with you. But you can find out more about speaking at the simple URL speak.coldfusionmeetup.com. All right. And with that, let's now turn it over to David. Thank you very much, sir, for coming on. I'll stop sharing and take it away.
Thanks, Charlie. I really appreciate that. And thank you for hosting me again. So again, this is my presentation called Improving Legacy Code While Retaining Your Sanity, some ColdFusion modernization challenges, and I do this with every presentation. Let's call it what it really is. This is group therapy. And the reason that I think that this is group therapy is because we've all been there. We've all had to either maintain or develop applications where we hated every single second of it. I have not met another developer where they haven't made this face on a pretty regular basis when dealing with a legacy app or looking at something that's old code or looking at something that they just don't quite understand. And it ends up being really frustrating. So for this presentation, I wanted to address this issue based on three simple questions. What are the most common frustrations when dealing with a legacy application? How were these conditions caused? And what can we do to mitigate these causes to prevent them from happening in the future? And I'm going to sprinkle memes throughout the entire presentation, because if we can't laugh while we're dealing with these frustrating problems, we might just kill ourselves. And I promise, although I will try, although I'm probably going to fail, not to give my presentation like this. So a little bit about myself. My name is David Byers. I'm an Adobe ColdFusion specialist. I have been a web developer for about 25 years now. I am Chief Technical Officer for Epicenter Consulting. Quick plug, we are hiring talented ColdFusion developers. If you are in the market, jobs@epicenterconsulting.com is the email address that you can hit up, as long as you don't suck. I'm active on the ColdFusion community portal at coldfusion.adobe.com. I'm a bit of a raconteur. All that means is I tell stories, as you will quickly learn. And I live in Las Vegas with my wife, who apparently wants to run an animal sanctuary, because now we're up to 3 cats, 4 house bunnies, and 2 bearded dragons. And trust me, the animals are the ones that rule the roost. However, let's get back to our little headache problem here. I think it's common to make sure that we're all on the same page and figure out, how do we define legacy code? There's a group of developers that I interact with on a regular basis, a couple hundred of us. And I asked them, I said, how do you define legacy code? Some of them said code without tests is legacy code. And I thought, okay, yeah. I mean, code with tests can still be considered legacy code. Somebody said old code. Well, old is relative. One of the developers said, you wouldn't believe it, we've had code that's been around since 2017. And I just kind of chuckled. Undocumented code, yes, that could be considered legacy code. Code that isn't currently being developed against. Code that's been in production and has been field tested. I think that this is kind of critical to legacy code. If your code has never seen the light of day of production, is it really legacy code, or is it just code that never got used? Code that's been abandoned or replaced with different code. Of course, yes, that could be considered legacy code. Code that isn't tracked by a code management system is another way. But I think for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to define legacy code as code that we didn't create or we don't completely understand, or don't agree with how it was built. Therefore, we aren't comfortable modifying it. Okay. As a matter of fact, I'm going to tell you something that I say on a regular basis when it comes to looking at legacy code. And this is other companies' code, other developers' code. A lot of times, this is my code. I am not exempt from this quote whatsoever, because trust me, I've looked back at some code that I've written and said, what the hell was I thinking? I could eat a box of alphabets and pit better code than this. And each of you owes me a nickel for every time that you use that. Here's the bad news. Okay. The bad news is what's done is done. Okay. Your application is what it is. Anyone who tells you that there's a quick and easy fix to improve legacy code is trying to sell you something. Because there is no magic bullet. The only thing that improves legacy code is hard work, and it can be daunting and it can definitely be discouraging. The good news is that I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know, but I'm going to validate your frustration. And I'm going to give you the arguments to explain why managing that legacy application is difficult. If somebody comes to you and says, what is taking so long? Why is this so hard? What do we need to do to improve this? You're going to get some ideas and some tips and tricks in this presentation to be able to help answer those things. The other thing is your application got you this far, so it must be doing something right. It can't all be crap, right? There's opportunity for professional growth in managing a legacy application. Managing a legacy application a lot of times is about making it better. Making it better involves improving your own skill set, learning more, being able to do those things. So there definitely is opportunity in a legacy application for you to professionally grow. Plus, the information I'm going to give you applies to development in general, not just CFML. So getting back to our three questions, the first one, what are the most common frustrations when dealing with a legacy application? I presented this to the ColdFusion developers group on Facebook. Thank you to everybody who responded. And I said, what are your biggest challenges about maintaining legacy code bases and applications? 37% of the people said application grew over time. It wasn't well thought out. Another 26 said no documentation or code comments. That's a big chunk. You know, we're over 60% with just those two elements, that the application grew over time, or there's no documentation, no code comments. If you throw in the next couple, no framework, no source control, you're at almost 80% of the biggest challenges about maintaining legacy code bases. Of course, there are others like old version of the CFML engine. A lot of applications you say, oh, wait, I can't do that because this is running on ColdFusion 10 and that function or feature wasn't introduced until CF 2016. The original developer was no longer available as a resource. And then the remainder of the answers I kind of threw into just a bucket saying other, like technical debt or siloed knowledge or non-meaningful variable names, things like that. But let's look at that largest piece of the pie. The application grew over time and wasn't well thought out. So I went to my developer community again and I asked them, I said, how many times has a project been given to you with a complete and thorough understanding of everything it needs to do with no changes needed whatsoever? And the results were kind of surprising. Majority of them said never. The rest of them also said never. I just didn't want to have a single color there on the chart. You know why? Because it doesn't happen. You don't have a lot of places where a large-scale application is so well documented and thought out and considered that there are no changes needed to it whatsoever. On top of that, we as developers, I believe, try to build these beautiful, crafted, elegant, perfect solutions. We strive for perfection when we are building applications. But a lot of times, we're under pressure from either management or time or budget or other developers or why isn't this done yet? And what happens is done frequently takes precedence over perfection. So what happens is the application then ends up growing or expanding because something wasn't well considered. Most application development is organic. Okay, these things grow over time. A lot of clients have asked me, when will my application be done? And from a realistic standpoint, I tell them, hopefully never. You know, hopefully you're always adding and expanding and making this better. And there's always more that you can do. The moment that you stop nourishing and watering and adding sunlight to this organic creature that is your application is the moment that it starts to wither and die. So How are these conditions caused? I mean, there's a myriad of answers to that question. Why did the application grow over time? Because it wasn't well thought out. Well, the idea wasn't fully fleshed out before development began. Okay, sure. Yeah, that happens a lot. The requirements changed. Happens all the time with legacy applications. The proper stakeholders weren't involved in the planning. I can't tell you how many times the development team will say, hey, I have a great idea for a feature. Let's build that into the application. And then sales and marketing and the business gets involved and they say, wait, you built this without consulting anybody else and it doesn't do what we need it to do. Unrealistic deadlines or timeline changes. You know, we need a full custom shopping cart system that's PCI compliant and it has to be done by Thursday. And you're like, it's Tuesday. That's unrealistic. Happens all the time. Not enough development expertise. Sometimes you have a team that isn't up to the challenge of building whatever it is that you're trying to build. Not enough budget or other resources. Don't have the right tools, software, environment, or infrastructure to do the work properly. All of these are perfectly valid excuses, unexpected results from what was developed. When I said that, somebody asked me in my group, they said, what do you mean by that? Well, it's pretty simple. It's, you know, you develop something and then the users come along and they screw it all up or they use it in a completely different way than you expected. Honestly, I watch this video all the time because I think it's hilarious. And I know that I have a captive audience right now. So unfortunately, I'm going to subject you all to watching this 1-minute video because, oh my God, does it ever speak to me?
This is a square. Can you guess which spot that goes in?
The square.
That's right. It goes in the square hole.
Yes. Okay.
And how about this rectangle? That one
Also the square.
goes in there too.
Yeah.
Up next, we've got this thin rectangle.
The thin
Can you guess
rectangle.
where that goes?
The thin rectangle.
That's right. It goes in the square hole. And up next, a cylinder.
The circle.
I think that goes in
The circle.
the square hole. Now, we've also got this semicircle right here. Do you see a slot that would fit
The semicircle.
semicircle?
The semicircle.
That's right. It's the square hole. Okay. Up next, the triangle. We know what hole that goes
The
into,
triangle.
right?
Triangle.
That's right. The square hole. And up next, we have the arch.
The arch. The arch.
You guessed it.
The arch.
It goes in the square hole.
You can see the angst on that developer's face every time. And I just like, yeah, I've been there. So what can we do to mitigate these causes and prevent them from happening in the future? Thank you for, obliging me that little indulgence. The biggest thing that you can do to help prevent these things, plan. You should invest a significant amount of time planning, discussing, researching, preparing your approach to an application before you ever write a single line of code. Create a scope document. Those are really important so that every stakeholder understands specifically what is intended to be built. Even when it comes to modifying or maintaining a legacy application, planning is paramount. Nothing causes forced organic changes to an application more than fly by the seat of your pants decision-making and a lack of planning. Now, when you do start your planning, be careful. Don't invest all of your time, energy, effort into the planning and designing phase and then not leave enough time, energy, effort, budget for the developing and testing and release phase. You don't want to end up with a horse that looks like this, okay? My next suggestion for making sure that this doesn't happen, modernize. And I know that some of the Ortus guys in the audience are going to say, or die, as they should. It's a great mantra. One of the easiest ways to open up modernization opportunities is to run the latest version of ColdFusion. Some versions of CF are nearing end of life, which means no new updates, no new security patches, no new bug fixes, etc. Plus, some of the newer versions also run faster, they have more features, and they give you a lot more opportunities to be able to modernize a legacy application. Look at the last 4 versions of ColdFusion. If you're running ACF 11, you're using an unsupported version. If you're running 2016, core support has ended, and extended support ends in about 8 months. The only 2 currently supported versions of ColdFusion are 2018 and 2021 that are fully supported in core support, not in the extended support range. Michaela Light, who's a great champion of the ColdFusion community at TerraTech, does a CF State of the Union survey every year. and the results of the 21 survey are out now. You can see, and again, this is focusing on ACF because this presentation is going to be designed for ColdFusion Developer Week. You can see that there are still people that are using CF8 or earlier. 8, 9, 10, and 11 all have representation within the ColdFusion community. And these are active users that are responding to a State of the Union survey. Of course, CF 2016 and CF 2018 make up the bulk of it, with CF 2021 coming up strongly because it's only been up for 6 months. But when you look at that graph, I mean, you have to realize there's 26% of the people out there that are using an unsupported version of ColdFusion. Another 27% are in only extended support. Less than half of those respondents are using a fully supported version of ColdFusion from Adobe. And if that doesn't change in the next 8 months, that graph is going to look like this, which is going to make me look like this, okay? On top of that, like I said, there's many modernization opportunities out there. Each new version of ColdFusion comes with major new features. I'm not going to bother reading them all, but I will highlight the API Manager and Performance Monitoring tool set. Those two features right there could be their own product, let alone be just baked into a newer version of ColdFusion. And then with the cloud abstraction functions and the package manager in CF 2021, there's a lot of different ways for you to be able to modernize your app, make it better, make it stronger. So definitely modernize your application, because some of these legacy applications were written years or even decades ago. Modern ColdFusion is robust, it's dynamic, and it's capable. It gives you many opportunities to take new approaches, new techniques, and new methodologies to make that legacy application more cutting edge. Basically, what I'm saying is, if you look at your code and it looks like this, yeah, it's time to modernize your application. Here's an example of a component that I would have written about maybe 10 years ago. You can see it's mostly tag-based. It is tag-based. I basically have two functions in here: get users and query to array of structures. And I can pass an ID and get the user record for a single user, or not pass an ID and get everything. It's fine, it works, but this is 10-year-old code, and that's basically what 10-year-old code looks like. As time went on and more features came out, I rewrote that page to look like this. This is actually ColdFusion 2018 update 5, I believe, when they introduced the fat arrow operator. So you can see that on line 17, I used the fat arrow operator to be able to get rid of that second function, to be able to turn that query into an array of structures. So now it's all script based. I'm using query execute. I'm setting local variables for the structures and to be able to set the values of the parameters and the options, so on and so forth. And I was really proud of this when I first wrote it, to the point where I actually blogged about it on the ColdFusion developer portal. Well, along comes CF 2021, and you can see on line 9 there, now I can do a return type of array. And now I don't need that second function, and I don't need the fat arrow operator. I can just return that as an array of structures using ColdFusion 2021. Then I started looking at this and saying to myself, why are you setting local variables for all of these and doing that? Why can't you just reduce this down to this? Okay, so now I have my get users function, does the exact same thing. I'm using a ternary operator there on line 8 with the question mark, where you can pass the ID. If you do, it'll automatically add the where clause. If not, it returns it as an array of structures. I mean, look at these two components. These two components do exactly the same thing. But this one is CF 2021. That one is something I would have written 10 years ago. New versions, more modern techniques to be able to work with your code gives you those opportunities to be able to modernize. Now, some people might look at that and say that less code is more modern code. Less code is not more modern code. That's a misnomer. And this is probably the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And this will play a big role in one of the stories I'm going to tell in a couple minutes. Less code does not also equal more efficient code. So remember that. The third suggestion that I have, refactor. Determine what areas of your application are ripe for refactoring, compartmentalize functionality where you can, determine what parts can be reused, or bring in another developer, pose a question to a developer community. Bring in a consultant to ask how they would change the approach. Like learn, talk to people and say, how would you do this differently in order to make that legacy application a little bit better? There's a gotcha with refactoring. I've seen a lot of refactoring components, refactoring projects rather, start to spiral out of control because people end up saying, hey, let's rebuild this one little part of it. Oh, but that connects to this, so we should rebuild that as well. And, maybe we should really redo the framework. And they start to spiral out of control. So my suggestion there, don't try to eat the whole burger, compartmentalize this down into more manageable chunks that you can refactor smaller parts of the application to make it better. Remember, your end goal is to leave things better than you found them. The second largest frustration when it comes to managing legacy applications is no documentation or code comments, no framework, no source control. I'm lumping the three of these together because they all cater to the same issue. Like I said, we as developers are doing big brain work. We have a lot of variables going on. When you start thinking about a solution to a problem, your mind is going in such a direction, which honestly, I believe explains why some developers will work for 14 hours straight and then disappear for 12 hours and you never see or hear from them. It's because once we get into the zone on developing an application, it's hard to get out of it. When that happens, and you're trying to pass that information off to another developer or somebody else is coming in and having to maintain it, where they get stuck is understanding two things: the developer's context and the developer's intention, okay? And I'll give you an example. What's this? What is it? Is it a circle? Well, yeah, it's a circle, but without the right context or intention, is it intended to just be a circle? Is it the letter O? Well, yeah, I guess it could be the letter O. Is it though? Is it the number 0? Is it a donut chart showing 100%? Yeah, I mean, it's all of these things, right? Is it an artist rendering of an aerial view of the Apple Park campus? Yeah, okay, I'm stretching there, but yeah, sure, go with me. It could be. And that's the thing. Without the context, without the intention of the developer, you have no idea what this is, okay? Because remember, we're developers, we're not mind readers, which brings me to a special point. There is a special place in hell reserved for developers who don't document or comment their code. And I got to tell you, I'm going to be right there with you because I suck at it. You know why? Because developers write the worst documents. It's plain and simple. We're too close to the code. We're too busy trying to get things accomplished and completed that documentation frequently falls by the wayside. I don't know if any of you have ever said this or worked with somebody who said this, where they've said, I'll document and comment my code once development's complete. Yeah, you will. You're lying. You're lying to me and you're lying to yourself because nobody ends up going back and doing it. It sucks. Nobody likes documentation. There's only been one company that I've ever worked with that did their documentation well. It's a company here in Las Vegas called Shift4. And the way that they did their documentation well is they had 2 people on staff full time to write the documentation. They had a technical writer from the developer's perspective and a technical writer from the user's perspective. And after you finished a project, you would meet with these 2 people and they would start documenting everything that you did and the changes to the code and so on and so forth. And they would understand your context and your intention. And their documentation was amazing. It's the only company I've ever seen to do it right because they had 2 people full-time on staff to be able to do it. Because remember, we're developers. We're not mind readers. Unfortunately, sometimes we kind of need to be mind readers. I worked with another company that I worked on a team where the developer never commented his code, a guy named John. And I said, John, question for you. Why don't you comment your code? And this was his actual response. And it kind of offended me. He said, look, if you're not smart enough to figure out what my code is doing, then you're not smart enough to be working here. And that really, it took me by a shock. And then I thought about what he said. If you're not smart enough to figure out what my code is doing, I said, wait a minute. If you don't understand that code comments are designed to answer the question, why is this code doing this, instead of what is this code doing, then maybe you aren't smart enough to be working here. I don't need a code comment like this. I know this is a cat. I get it. I'm smart enough to say this is a cat. You don't have to treat me like an idiot to say I need to label this cat. Otherwise, you might not know what it is. What I want to know is, whose cat is this? Why is it sitting here? Where did this cat come from? What does this cat interact with? Where's its food bowl? Here's a real example. I was consulting for a company and I came across this piece of code. And this was actually new code that a developer had written. And I was brought in to basically talk to their team and teach them better ways of doing things, even though I don't do them myself. So he put this code out there, set A and B to be random numbers between 1 and 100. Okay. Then multiply them and hash the result. Okay. And I brought him in and I said, do me a favor. I need a more meaningful code comment than this. This makes no sense. Yes, I see that you have A and B as random numbers. I see that you're multiplying them and hashing them. What I want to know is why. What is A? What is B? Why are we multiplying them and hashing them to be C? And his result, actually, in my opinion, was very positive. This is what he said. He said, the code creates a hash based on an integer between 1 and 1,000,000. Okay. We use this in the user login system. Okay. When the user logs in, there's a similar function that gets run, and we compare the hash of the number generated at login with the hash of the number in their user record. If it matches, they've won the lottery and they get a special discount. Okay, I don't necessarily agree with the approach, but I understand what you're doing now. And then he goes on to say, we originally did this as a random range between 1 and 1,000,000, but we determined that there was more randomness applied to creating two random numbers and multiplying them. And I thought to myself, okay, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But actually you're skewing your results, because then you have a 1 in 1,000 times chance of it being 0, which means your probability of hitting 0 will be much greater. Anyway, that was an argument I didn't want to have. The code comment itself, which was the goal of this operation, is great. I understand what it's doing. I understand why it's doing it. So if I need to go back in here and make modifications to A, B, and C, I can do so and understand what the implications are. Now, that was a really positive experience, which was great. Now I'd like to talk about what I refer to as the nightmare scenario. I got called in to consult for a company who had just fired their primary developer, and it was a bad breakup. The developer left, and you can't fire me, I quit. You can't quit, I fired you. So anyway, he ended up leaving, and they brought me in to basically document their code and put a document together that it tries to make sense of exactly what their application is doing and how it works. So I said, okay. Little did I know. I dive into the code and I come across something like this. Okay, CF loop query equals get ID. I'm going to ignore the fact there's no T-body tag. Get ID. Okay, we're getting an ID. ID, and then ID, and then ID details. And I'm thinking to myself, what is this? So I have to track this back to this query. So let's track down the query. I get to the query, and this is what I see. Now, if you're quick-minded and you look at this query, you're probably already making this face. Okay, did you catch it? Because I'm looking at this, I'm saying, okay, select ID, IID, ID, ID details from I. Wait a minute, I is an alias? Wait, why isn't I alias? Normally I is an alias of a table. Certainly I'm not going to look into the database and see a table named I, right? Inner join ID, also not alias. Certainly there's not going to be a table called ID, right? Well, I look into the database and this is what I see. Tables A, AD, C, CO, E, I, ID, J, L, P, PN, R, S, U, and Z. So I closed my laptop. I went out to the parking lot. I did this in my car for a good solid 10 minutes. And then I went back in and I said, look, this developer that you fired, he must have talked to somebody. He had friends here. He had lunch with somebody. Who do I talk to? And they said, well, he met with this guy named Paul a lot, had lunch with him, so on and so forth. I said, okay, I want to talk to Paul. So I talked to Paul and I said, Paul, what's going on here? And he said, well, first off, I like this job more than I like that guy. He had a giant ego and was kind of an ass. Okay, that's great to know. He said, the first thing you need to know about him is that he thought that the fewer characters that the code had, the faster it would run. Remember I said that this was going to be making a comeback? Yeah, here it is. Less code does not equal more efficient code, but he thought it did. He thought that fewer characters, smaller variable names meant more efficient code. And that's what resulted in tables like this. And I'm scratching my head thinking, really contemplating my life choices and whether or not I should put a shotgun in my mouth and pull the trigger with my toes. When he says, this guy also thought that if he made the code very difficult to read, he'd never get fired. And I said, aha, there's the real reason. Okay. So now I know that he's intentionally making this difficult to understand. So I start digging into the tables and trying to figure out context and intention of what these tables are, where the data is. And this is pretty much what I came up with. A, accounts, AD, addresses, C, contacts, CO, countries. Now, the two tables that I'm looking for, the I and the ID, are actually invoices and invoice details. I'm like, oh, okay, so we're not getting an ID, we're getting invoice. Wait, what are invoice details? So I start looking into that table and I see these are actually line items. Okay, this makes a lot more sense now. So now with that context and that intention in mind, now I can look at this query that he wrote and say, get invoices.id, invoices.invoice ID, invoice details, invoice detail ID. And I thought to myself, wow, he really made this hard for no reason at all. And I thought to myself, how much better would this be for not only himself, but anybody else that looks at this code if this is the way that it were laid out? Spell out the tables, spell out the variable names, make it a little bit more reasonable moving forward. But like I said, that was the nightmare scenario. So what can we do to mitigate these causes and prevent them from happening in the future? I hate to say it, you got to document, knowing that the applications are organic in nature, this won't be the last time that you or someone else has to manage the code. So you need to write code comments and documentation to support what you did and take some of the guesswork out of future development efforts. Avoid obfuscation. This is a big one for me. Use variable names that make sense. My personal opinion is to avoid abbreviations. I know some people are big on, I want to abbreviate everything. I try not to. Try not to over-engineer your application. The more places a developer has to look to find where the guts of an application are, the more time it's going to take to manage that legacy application. And that's really important. That's a really important concept to take a look at and say, try not over-engineer your applications. Sometimes you just need a bottle opener. You don't need to build this big fancy machine that rips the tops off of bottles. This is totally me. In the beginning, I thought I'm going to make these beautiful, complex, everything's going to be great. Now I'm definitely in the year X mode. Let me write this so that future me and future somebody else can easily understand it. And I got to tell you, there's nothing, oh, look at that. There's nothing wrong with this. Okay. This is a perfectly acceptable way to write an application. Next, set coding standards. The use of a framework such as ColdBox or Framework One are easy ways to set coding standards of how an application should be written. If implementing a framework into a legacy application is too much of a burger to eat, consider writing your own standards for code or adopting someone else's. I know that the fantastic group over at Ortus, they publish their coding standards out to the web. Pick them up and just start adopting those coding standards because they make sense, and it'll at least put your developers all on the same page when it comes to how an application should be written, where the variables are, how they are expected to be named, everything down to the casing. It's a great coding standard. Now, there's one thing that I haven't talked about that every legacy application you have to consider at some point, and that is knowing when to say when. Okay, there comes a time when the decision needs to be made on whether or not to scrap a legacy application in favor of new development. It's a business decision, and it needs to be based on the needs of the application, its longevity. Rebuilding from scratch is the nuclear option. Honestly, though, sometimes it's the best one. We've all looked at legacy applications and said, good God, we need to scrap this and just start over. And sometimes that's what you end up needing to do. So what have we learned? Plan. Make sure that you create a scope document for when you're creating new applications and working on existing applications. Try to think as much of the application through as you possibly can. Modernize your application. CF in 2021 is not the same as it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 3 years ago. So make sure you're running an up-to-date version and use the tools and tricks and learn better ways to be able to modernize your functionality. Refactor it. Don't try to eat the whole burger when you do. You will get yourself into a big rabbit hole if you end up doing that. Remember, the goal is to leave things better than you found them. Document your code. It sucks. I don't care. Do it. Future you is going to thank you for it. Work that into the budget. And it should be significant to be able to say, nope, we need to go back and document everything that we're doing here because it's important and it will make future development easier. Try to avoid obfuscation. Don't create intentional bottlenecks to understanding the context and intention of how an application works or what it does. Make sure you set coding standards. Frameworks and coding standards put developers on the same page when it comes to process. And finally, know when to say when. Starting from scratch is sometimes the best solution. When it comes to legacy applications, we all kind of need to have a group cry because they suck to deal with, and there are ways that you can make them better. And this is identifying the problem in a way to try and make it better. Because trust me, if you do these little things, these efforts will help make your development world a better place. And that's all I've got.
All right. Short and sweet. 20 minutes early. So now's a good time. If there's questions, feel free to ask them. And I'll just tell you, I've been watching all the conversation and I don't think there's been any question that's outstanding. But if anybody had one, go ahead and ask it again to save them going back to read through all the comments.
That's because I ramble on and don't shut up.
No. It was very tight. Well done. You might want to think about that. You'll be done early for if you follow the same pace.
That's part of the reason why I wanted to do a real walkthrough on this was to make sure my timing was okay.
And you could not change anything, and yet the second time it'll take 50 minutes. You just can't. Exactly. You never know what'll catch your attention, and there may be. I'm not sure what that new platform is going to be like, so it might be more obvious to you that there's questions, or there may be a different audience that tends to ask lots of questions. That'll slow you down. Right. So there's Joshua asking. I'll click on here. And by the way, I agree with everybody on the positive regards about it. So, that's weird. Does that show up as only half the screen to you?
Yeah, it's a bottom third for me.
But I mean, I only see the words "any comments" and "when to leave."
No, mine says any comments on the question is any comments on the decision making of when to refactor and when to leave it. Ultimately, it comes down to a business decision. Take a look at how much time you're investing in discovery on that legacy application. We have legacy applications that I've worked with that every single task becomes a discovery project. And that's when we said, okay, we need to refactor the way that some of this works because we're spending 6 hours of discovery to do a 1 hour task. And once we started to analyze that information and understand how much was actually going into learning how the application worked versus coding against the application, that made the business decision for us pretty obvious. I hope that answers your question.
And I made a comment earlier that I want to repeat in case it wasn't seen by everybody, and maybe you didn't notice it either, is that, you talked about how when it gets to be a point where it just makes sense to rewrite or refactor. And for a lot of people, their first reaction is to another language.
Right.
And that's not a given.
It's not a given. No, absolutely not. I mean,
and a big point you were making throughout is that CFML has changed a lot.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the way somebody would have written something 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it could be written very differently now. So if you're going to rewrite it, if you've got the skills to rewrite in a more modern way, the point I'm stressing, and you did make it along the way, is CFML can be used to write it in a more modern way. And of course, there's pros and cons to that. Somebody might argue that they want to move to a different, language entirely because they can get broader, developers support or whatever. But the point, and I'm going to make this point in my talk at the summit, which will be on CF at 25, not the kid everyone thinks it is that it's evolved in so many ways. And sometimes you might be able to take somebody that's skilled in another language and have them rewrite something for you in CFML.
Yeah.
And they could apply their better skills at development, even though they've not written any CFML before, because they'll go, oh, I can use fat arrow functions. Oh, I can use closures. I can use, rest and spread operators. I can use functional programming. And they'll be like, I didn't know CFML could do that.
Which really comes down to knowing your deck. You need to know the talents of your development team, or whether or not you're looking to move to a different development team. It depends on the audience. If you ask a developer who is a ColdFusion developer, what language should we rebuild our application in? They're going to say ColdFusion. If you ask a CTO or a CIO, that same question, they may come up with a different answer because they say, finding ColdFusion talent is really difficult. And, if I put an ad out for a Python developer, I'm going to get 500 responses. Whereas if I put an ad out for a ColdFusion developer, I might get 10 responses. So, it's a matter of knowing your deck, knowing the skills and talent that's on your team, but also not abandoning investments that you've made. If you have infrastructure, licensing, software, all focused around ColdFusion, you've made a significant investment in ColdFusion already. Are you really ready to abandon that in favor of another language? What's the cost of ramping that up and bringing other developers in and having them up to speed when you're, truly nuking your application? Maybe that should be my final slide. I'll just
there you go. How about that?
Yeah, there we go. That's my final slide of the application.
By the way, let's also throw out, since we got a few minutes here, that another thing people really need to keep in mind is that you'll often hear people say, we're going to move off to whatever. And I hear it in my work, because I help solve problems. And sometimes they'll say, we're not going to update ColdFusion because we're moving off of it. And a year later, 2 years later, I reach out and they haven't done it.
We're going to move off of it. Yeah.
Because there's so much logic in these applications that it's not going to be easy. And many, many, many times I've heard from people who said somebody put their foot down and, quote, rewrote the app in some other platform or got an off-the-shelf solution. And people are complaining left and right that it doesn't do anywhere near what the old app did. Well, again, let's just keep that sort of stuff in mind, because you can definitely modernize, rewrite, refactor, and stay in CFML, and there's an argument for that. And again, the developers who are the, quote, CF developers in-house, they could be educated in ways to write better code. And somebody mentioned about moving on to an alternative framework. For sure, that's another solution. You mentioned it a couple times, and it's definitely something that some people should consider. Some apps, it's going to be really hard to redo in the framework, but that might be the right way to solve some problems. So you just have to weigh all these things.
Yeah. And you have to consider the investment. If the investment is, we've had clients that in 2018 said, we no longer need your services because we're going to be launching a new version of our website. It's coming January 2020. And then January 2020, it's coming May 2020. Yeah. And then May 2020, it's coming January 2021. They're still not off of it. And we're still maintaining a legacy application based on ColdFusion that they haven't put any real investment in to the last almost 3 years now, because they're saying, we're going to move to this other platform. And I've had discussions with people before where I've said, when? Are you lying to me and lying to yourself when you say that this is going to be done by this date? I don't think you understand how much of a burger you're going to eat there.
Yep. And there's been some good comments along the way there. Folks can follow along there. I want to pick up on one particular one that Jerry shared about. I'll say that when the question comes up to corporate regarding older CF apps, they usually default to let's replace it with an enterprise cloud app. And we should, make the point that not only has CF 2021 itself specifically added new cloud integration capabilities, but CF 2018 and 2016, as well as 2021, could all be deployed in containers. And sometimes that's a solution to the cloud aspect of deployment. It's more about the deployment and the management of that they rub against. And you can deploy CFML as containers. There's Adobe provided Docker images and Ortus command box provided images for both ColdFusion and Lucy. And then Lucy's got its own images, and all these things can be orchestrated with Kubernetes. And so, that's another realm where developers often maybe don't get involved in that, don't maybe even care to pay attention to it, especially if you're an older developer focused on your job and your language. But when you hear them say things like, we want to move to the cloud, that doesn't have to mean rewrite it to another language.
That's a true story. And I mean, I'll tell you about a slick setup that I've seen in an application just recently. The developers develop everything locally on Docker images that are running ColdFusion. They're actually running command box. And then when they push the code, they're using a Bitbucket pipeline to be able to zip that code up, post it to S3, and then they're using AWS Cloud Deploy to actually pick up that code on S3, unzip it, and install it on individual servers, by taking one out of the rotation in their load balancer, installing the code on it, bringing it back up, taking the next one out of rotation. It's a pretty slick setup. So, I mean, there's lots of ways to fix the deployment issue without make sure that you understand what is truly a DevOps issue and what is a development issue. Those two are not the same.
Yeah. But, a lot of CF people are maybe not paying attention to those things. And sometimes they either think it can't be done, or more importantly, the people that are making decisions think it can't be done with CF.
Right. And I tell people all the time, anything is possible with the proper application of time and money. You give me enough time. Magic Johnson used to have AIDS. Time, money, no more AIDS. Right? I'm kidding. Too soon? Sorry.
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of landed flat. That's okay. I can't be hilarious all the time, Charlie.
So there's a couple more comments coming up there. We use Jenkins. Yep, don't touch the servers when deploying. And good for you, Joshua. That's, so rare for so many CF shops. They're all still touching their servers all the time.
Yeah.
There's, a percentage of people that have modernized in that regard. And that's something else, by the way, David, as you contemplate the new talk, or not the new, as you contemplate giving it again, you might want to throw in a couple points about deployment aspects and making that point that, there's a lot that people can do to improve things that don't even mean touching your code.
Right. And I think that especially when it comes to legacy application, for anybody who hasn't heard of the analogy of treating servers like pets and treating servers like cattle, the more modern approach is to treat your server like cattle. You want to be able to effectively slaughter it at any time without giving it a name or, feeding it and making it a pet. We name our pets. We love our pets. We're comforting to our pets, but cows are cows. The more modern approach is to generally treat servers like cattle than like pets. So I think a lot of legacy applications and people maintaining legacy applications get stuck in that mindset of, oh, well, we have to have a server and it has to be set up exactly this way. And moving away from that is going to be troublesome. And it's really not. Once you set up the right environment and have the right tools and software in place to be able to automate a lot of that, you can create and destroy servers ad nauseum.
So looking at a couple other comments, Sandy made a comment there that legacy ColdFusion apps are often judged based on clunky UIs and bad navigation. And we should say, well, that can absolutely be done with any other language. Yes, CF tends to get blamed for it. And CF apps tend to be older and have been written years ago when people didn't have those better understanding of how to do things better. And then the code's not been touched. Nobody wants to touch it. That's legacy.
Well,
Nobody
and
wants to touch it.
I think that one of ColdFusion's greatest strengths is also one of its greatest downfalls. There is such a low cost of entry to ColdFusion that many developers who have no programming experience, picked up ColdFusion and were able to run with it. And because they were able to run with it, they were able to create something that, sure, it works, but it's not very elegant. It's not very robust. It doesn't really, you can't expand it very easily. And there are many applications out there that once the developer created it, they learned what they needed to know, they built what they needed to build with it, and then kind of just stopped and maintained it from then on without it constantly improving their skills or seeing what the modernization opportunities were with newer versions or different functions or different ways of doing it.
Yeah. And as the other side of the coin, I thought maybe you were going to go down this route, is that perhaps we could argue another negative CF is that it strives so much to be backward compatible so that often old ways of doing things are still allowed to be done.
Yes.
And it's only been in the last year, or couple releases, that Adobe started to truly deprecate, and now they call retire, some features where the UI elements were based on, very old Yahoo UI toolkits that even Yahoo no longer updates for the past several years.
Yeah.
And those things were still working, and people didn't have a reason to get off of them. Now Adobe's kind of forcing them. That's pretty rare that they force you, but people could argue that if they made more hard decisions like that and forewent compatibility, that would force people to modernize. But that's a tough call for Adobe to do. I can promise you there's a lot of people screaming still when they move up to a CF version that doesn't support those old UI things, and they go, I don't want to have to rewrite everything.
Forced work,
fixed, we should say. But go
yeah,
ahead.
I mean, to that end, this component will work. It's an older way to do it, but it works just fine.
Yep.
Because of the backward compatibility. It's not a real modern way to do it, but it definitely does work. Any other questions we need to hit up?
One's been asked and answered by others, and not so much a question, but Daniel made a comment about it'd be great to have more documentation of DevOps for CFML in the cloud, and he's right.
Yep, that's definitely good feedback.
Which, of course, we can't fix, but there are solutions out there. By the way, we should throw out, I don't think you'd mentioned it, that Ortis and Luis in particular wrote modern CFML in 100 minutes.
Yes.
And then, of course, they've got Command Box, and they have lots of tools. And then somebody else asked about more information about ColdBox, and Daniel's responding with some good answers on that. But that's a way to answer that point that people would like to see better documentation of things. Don't look at it only from Adobe. Look more broadly.
Yeah.
For instance, there's I can't remember the exact URL, but there InLeague is a company, and if you look for InLeague ColdFusion Docker, I forget the exact title and link. I'll look it up when I'm not talking. But they did basically an online book about deployment of CFML in Docker. I think it had Swarm in its name because it was written back when Swarm was something that some people thought was going to be a good way to go. Kubernetes kind of taking its place, but forget about that. There's still great value in the majority of what's in there, and a lot of it's about Lucy, and I think it might even talk about Ortis command box images. And at the time they started at the Adobe, CF images weren't there. But again, don't let that hold you up. Just that talks about DevOps concepts for deploying CFML, and there's a lot of different ways to do it, and a lot of resources out there that again may not be from Adobe necessarily.
And on top of that, Luis's book, Modern ColdFusion in 100 Minutes, is a great resource. It's a fantastic book, and it supports a good cause. There's a charity involved in it, so
Yep. And so good. I think it was, whoever had asked that question, you definitely look to a lot of what Ortis is doing, both in their resources, in their CF casts, in their Modernize or Die podcast. They're trying in many ways to lead the CF and CFML community to being more modern in many, many, many ways. Yeah. So just got to sift through to find which things apply well to your particular needs. Not everything's going to apply to everybody's needs, but some things will grab them.
Which of course goes back to, don't try to eat the whole burger. Find a small section of what it is that they're suggesting that you modernize, and implement it in smaller bits.
So, hey, Bill, I see your last comment there, and David, take a look at that. Love the Star Trek bridge background sounds. I'm not sure what Bill's referring to. Do you know what he's referring to?
I'm not entirely sure, but
I wonder if it's that sound I was telling you about. That would be kind of funny.
It might be. It might just be my mic. It might just be.
So, Bill, let us know if you get a chance.
Maybe I'm really on a starship.
That's right. So if there's not any more comments, we'll wait to see if Bill has a comment there. But anybody else now, faint beeping and humming. Oh, that's interesting. I don't really hear that.
Could be the fan from my eGPU. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what the beep is, but.
Beep. Oh, I'm hearing it now. I do. Beep. It's very faint. Yeah. What is that?
I don't know.
That's so funny. Now I'm not hearing it. Bill's got super sensitive hearing or headphones on. And Daniel thought it was his eardrum. Too many concerts as a teenager. Yeah, it's funny. No, yeah, now all of a sudden, good thing you brought that up at the end because we're all going to hear it.
Great. Now that's all anybody's going to hear.
That's right.
There's nothing beeping in my house. I promise.
Awesome. All right, sir. Well, so again, he'll be repeating this talk at the CF Dev Week, which is next week. If you hadn't heard about it, just Google ColdFusion Developer Week 2021. It's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week with 2 tracks of 3 to 4 talks per track per day, spaced out with an hour plus between them. So not overwhelming and all free. You just have to register to be, kept up to date and notified, get the link and all that stuff. So we'll look forward to seeing you all there. See his talk, see my talk, see other several talk dozen, about 20 talks, I believe, total. So come check it out. All right, David, thanks again for coming on.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much.
We'll talk to you guys later. Till the next time. See y'all.